Hello and welcome to TelecomTV. I'm Martyn Warwick and I'm talking with Martyn Casado, who is the CTO of Networking at VMware and is also one of the actual fathers of SDN. He's one of those who was intimately involved in its inception. Pleasure to meet you, Martyn. Tell us about, begin with, how you got into SDN.
Sure. So I guess the kind of prehistory is actually, I did my grad school at Stanford, but before that I was working with the government and in particular the intelligence agencies. And at that time it was actually very clear to me that networking was very different to compute when it came to building technology. So with compute, if the computer didn't come with the types of characteristics you need, for example, assuming you're going to defend against a nation state, you would simply program it. But with networking, you kind of got what you were given, and there was not much that you could do. And it was actually a big operational hurdle for us. It was very difficult for us to implement the security policies we wanted within the network. So using that background, I moved on to Stanford to do my grad studies, and I worked with a phenomenal group of people, including Nick McCune, who was my advisor, Scott Shanker, who was a professor at Berkeley, and we did this base work, which is how do you change networking to make it more programmable, to have more of the properties of compute, and that a lot of that led to OpenFlow, and then what was later called SDN. So that was one of the tendrils that was the genesis of this.
And how long ago was that?
Boy, 7 years now. Yeah, so I graduated in 2007. I started in 2003. So, 10 years ago was the genesis of Stanford. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting. I've not met anybody who was there at the start. Just how and when do you think will open source, open network, open compute actually reshape the network fundamentally? Is it still to come? Is it happening, or has it already taken place and we just don't know it?
Yeah. Well, so I think this is an interesting question. Often we view SDN and open source and networking as this existential threat, right? It's something that's coming out externally and it's going to have this big impact and it's going to boil the oceans and shift the tectonic plates and so forth. And I would actually encourage people to explore how networks are being built in the most sophisticated environments. And I actually posit that open source and open networking has been here for a long time. We just haven't really been looking at it that way. And the reason I say that is if you look at some of the largest, most successful environments in the world, those that are built by the mega data centers and those that build infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, for a long time they've been building data centers and where the networks do very, very little functionality. They just pass packets. And the majority of the functionality has been re-implemented in software at the edge in the application. So it has all the properties of SDN, right? I mean, the functionality is in software. It's on the edge, it's under the control of the user, and the network becomes very generic. And so I think in many ways, these concepts have been around for a long time. They host a large percentage of the world's workloads. And now we as a community are starting to understand this and generalize this so everybody can take advantage of these trends.
So the network is there. Is it our approach, our understanding of the network that is changing, or is it the network itself? Carl Sagan said, if we met an alien, we wouldn't know because he's an alien. So does this apply to the network?
No, I think it's a fantastic question, which is, we've been using networks in certain ways for a very long time, and I think that there are certain market segments, especially around new data centers, where they've been using it in a different way, but they haven't been very public about it. But if you look at these very successful data centers and the Googles and the Microsofts and the Amazons, you'll realize that they've already done a lot of what we talk about in open networking. They've already moved functionality from hardware into software. So I think it's more that we understand how these innovative companies are using it, how they've done it over the last 10 years. We realize that this is the result of kind of very technical thinking, very technical architecture, resulting in some of the best data centers in the world. And now these paradigms that were developed are generalizing so the rest of us can use them.
Okay. Do you think that open source will inevitably become more closed and more proprietorial as manufacturers seek to regain the initiative away from the service providers who presently have it?
I personally have been deeply involved in open source for a long time. I mean, Open vSwitch came out of my team. I've been deeply involved in OpenStack. Before that, I've been involved in Linux in various ways and other open source libraries. And I think along the way, I've kind of lost my Pollyannic view of open source. And I'm not sure that open source itself is intrinsically what we want. I think what we want is horizontal composition. And I think if you look at the industry is doing a lot of the right things, like OpenStack. OpenStack is much less about open source, and it's more about open interfaces, open standards, so I can mix and match pieces. So I don't know what will happen to open source. I think it's a very important element of this of the industry. I do think that companies can use it. They can both pull it back, but they can also use it to lock in customers. So I think we as an industry, what's important is we focus on open interfaces. We focus on open standards, and we make sure the technology get developed can snap into those, and then we protect ourselves whether it's open source or it's not.
Both individuals and enterprises say that they really are in favor of disruptive technology. They love it, and it's the way to go and all the rest of it. That's when they're talking on the record. Off the record, they often say, oh my God, what's going to happen to us next? We don't know where we're going, or we don't know what we're doing. We don't know this perpetual Maoist sort of continuing revolution. You can never settle into anything before it changes again. What do you make of that sort of argument that disruptive innovation, is it a necessary evil that we have to contend with and use parts of it as selectively as we can? Or is it a godsend for the evolved network?
That's interesting. You know, listen, I don't want to resort to a cliche, but
no, leave that to me.
But I think, you know, as with all change, you have a bit of both. I mean, I think that we should accept that in this case, the change is inevitable. It really is inevitable. And the result of that change is we're going to solve new use cases, which is good. And it's going to disrupt things both from the vendor standpoint and the consumer standpoint. I mean, if you look at the industry, if we automate everything, there are many people that are out of a job, for example, right? And so there are benefactors and there are those that are kind of at the short end of the stick. And so I think what's important, though, is to realize that change is change. Again, I don't want to pontificate too much, but change is change. And in this case, the market forces are going to follow the use cases. They're going to follow the money, and the change is going to happen. I think it's totally inevitable. I think we have enough proof points to know this is going to happen. So it's important for us is to not fight the change. We'll acknowledge there will be collateral. We'll acknowledge people will have to get out of the comfort zone. We'll acknowledge that some of the big companies will go on their heels because they're not really sure how to adapt to this. And so rather than fight it and stop it and slow it down, I think we should embrace it. We should try to mitigate the damage and then move it forward. So again, that was a long answer. The synopsis is it's going to be a bit of both, but it's going to happen anyways, so let's embrace it and minimize the impact.
Do you think the time will come when the NFV tail will wag the SDN dog?
So this is a great question. So to me, comparing SDN and NFV are like comparing a mechanism and a solution, which it's very difficult to compare the two things. So there are a number of very interesting use cases for SDN. One of them is NFV. So to me, NFV is disaggregating the networking service from the box so it can be available to anyone, anywhere, right? So for example, in the L4 through 7 space, making firewalls or load balancers available to customers. And so, so it is largely a solution that you could implement using an SDN style approach. So NFV is a very important use case for SDN. It's got its own core technology that's important, but there are also other very important use cases. So I work with network virtualization. It's got a tremendous amount of traction right now. We've got multiple products, not just us. I mean, many companies have products that are being sold today for real revenue. It's another use case. So I think NFV is an important use case. I think it will drag along SDN and get it to mature, just like network virtualization will do that. And I think we'll find other use cases in the future. So again, I find this is an application space. It should drive SDN. And SDN, again, it's a mechanism for implementing these things.
Absolutely fascinating interview. Martyn Casado, thank you very much indeed.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.